actually written before the end of 1483. It was written by the 1st of December. And the important thing about it, and the impact of its discovery 50 years ago, is that, of course, up to that time, everyone had been able to say, well, the hostile views of Richard III came from people who were writing after the Battle of Bosworth. Here, for the first time, was a good, coherent account written well before Bosworth.
He was an Italian, and did he have any grasp of the English language?
Not a lot, we understand. He, of course, spoke Latin, and as I hope I'll show, he mixed with people who were his own countrymen, who spoke English and also spoke, obviously, Italian to him.
He has been described, I think, by Mr. Potter, the chairman of the Richard III Society, as a man of integrity and an honest reporter. Do you agree with that?
Yes, a very sound judgment by Mr. Potter.
What sort of sources do you think he had?
Well, we know for a start that he had contacts in Edward IV's court and also later on in the household of Edward V. In particular, Dr. Argentine, the king's physician, a man, of course, who had inside information about what was happening around Edward V. This was a vital contact for him. He also, I think, would have been able to talk to fellow Italians in London, Genoese merchants, we're pretty certain, and generally people in London.
In relation to the princes themselves, does he record very early in the introduction to this record, does he indicate Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who shortly after destroyed Edward's children?
Yes, those are the words.
And does he also refer in another place, this is the end of chapter 5, my lord, to men bursting into tears? What's that reference?
Well, he tells us that he observed people himself in the streets of London bursting into tears when they thought and contemplated about the fate awaiting, particularly Edward V.
And he ends up with the words, I think, already there was a suspicion that he had been done away with. Whether, however, he has been done away with and by what manner of death, so far I've not at all discovered.
Yes, that's a very good example of his honesty. He admitted that he hadn't been able to find out exactly what had happened, though he suspected very strongly.
Does he also refer to in the course of this story, to the death of Hastings?
Yes, he does.
Referring to the Protector rushing headlong into crime.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think there's a further quotation which starts, "Thus fell Hastings."
Yes, killed, it's a very nice one, killed not by those enemies he'd always feared, but by a friend he had never doubted.
Yes, very well. Well, now turning to Croyland, please. I think that was a chronicle written in 1486.
Yes,
Do we know who the writer was?
Probably Bishop John Russell of Lincoln.
A very well-connected person.
Yes, he had been, in fact, Chancellor for Richard III. That's the sort of chief minister of the Crown.
Now, I think it's correct that he does nowhere in that record directly accuse Richard.
No, he does not.
But does he quote from a poem in the course of his writing?
Yes, there's a strange little poem right at the end of his account in which he states that Richard III destroyed his brother's progeny.
And what interpretation do you put upon the fact that he included that and that particular poem in his record of these events?
That he was the cause of his nephew's ruin.
Destroyed his brother's progeny goes a little further than that.
Well, I think many people would argue that, yes.
Yes, I see.
At that time, when I say at that time, I think to be precise, on January the 15th, 1484, did the French Chancellor make an observation in public?
Very similar kind. The Estates General of France had met then. He said the children of King Edward were killed with impunity and the crown transferred to their murderer.
And Philip Comines, I think a French historian, a writer of European history at that time.
Yes.
Does he accuse both Richard and Buckingham of being a party to this matter?
He tells us that Richard barbarously murdered his nephews, and he also says that the deed was actually done by the Duke of Buckingham on Richard's orders.
Well, now, the other matter about which I want to ask you is the question of pre-contract. First of all, and if you can, simply in just a sentence or two, Dr. Pollard, what was the position of a pre-contract of marriage by canon law?
Well, I think it's been well established fairly recently that there are two basic kinds of pre-contract that we're talking about. One is simply when a man and woman become man and wife by simple exchange of vows and a statement saying, I do marry you. In effect, what takes place in the church service today. The other, and the one I suspect which is relevant in this case, is a promise to marry is made. And it is significant in this respect, once a promise is made. If the couple then nip into bed, then I think it is said that the marriage is a genuine one that has taken place. So sexual intercourse has to follow the promise.
Yes, and then it becomes a valid contract.
Then it becomes a valid contract.
Yes. Now, what were the facts here? Again, if you could outline them very shortly to us.
Well, I think we here must refer to the titulus regis. Now, that's the formal Act of Parliament which laid down Richard's claim to the throne, where he put down strictly for the record what the situation was as he wished to say it was. And in this document, he says, Edward IV was pre-contracted to Eleanor Butler, that therefore, the marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. Therefore, the sons of that marriage, the princes, were bastards. Therefore, they could not inherit the throne. And thus, he, Richard, held the title because his elder brother, the Duke of Clarence, had been attainted and there was no one else between him and the throne.
When you say his elder brother had been attainted, Clarence, I think, had been accused of treason.
That's right.
And therefore, in that way, had been disinherited.
That's right.
So between the princes, between Edward IV, after Edward IV, Richard was the proper king.
Yes.
Now, what I really want to ask you is this. This suddenly arose in the middle of June of 1483. Mm-hmm. Had anybody ever made this suggestion before?
No.
That there had been a pre-contract and therefore the Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was invalid?
Not this specific
Do we
thing.
know where the source of this suggestion came from in June of 1483?
Well, we know from Commune that it was Bishop Robert Stillington.
That's Philip Commune, who you mentioned
the
before.
man we've just mentioned, yes, who was Bishop of Bath and Wells. And in fact, that's confirmed by record sources of 1485.
That Bishop Stillington was the source of this information?
Yes, that is right.
Having been a witness to the pre-contract?
That is
Eleanor
right.
Butler.
He says he was the only witness.
Well, now, I think what happened was that on the 22nd of June, the two princes having been placed together in the Tower on the 16th of June, I think I'm right in saying.
Yes.
And the coronation of Richard being 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, on the 6th of July. On the I think it was the 22nd of June, was it not, that a priest, Dr. Shaw,
yes,
preached at St. Paul's Cross,
yes,
the bastardy of these princes?
yes.
And was that accepted?
Yes, people did accept it.
But do we find that Mancini says that these matters having been raised, that he sought the crown for himself. On hearing this, the Lords consulted their own safety, warned by the example of Hastings, perceiving the alliance of the two dukes, Richard and Buckingham, whose power, supported by a multitude of troops, would be difficult and hazardous to resist.
Yes. I think it could be said that the Duke of Buckingham and Richard made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
So finally, Dr. Pollard, I think the position was this. You say there was, upon the basis that this pre-contract was genuine or a pretext.
A pretext.
What should have happened legally?
Well, the facts of the case concerning matrimonial law should have gone to an ecclesiastical court.
Did Stillington ever give evidence anywhere?
There's no record that he was ever examined by anybody.
And did Mancini and Croyland, from the two quotes you've already given us, did they appear to believe it or not?
Well, neither of them did, and I think we've seen the way that Mancini didn't. The Croyland chronicler quite bluntly calls it this colour for this act of usurpation. He tells us he believes it was a bill invented in the north, and he goes on to suggest that the Duke of Gloucester was the sole mover of what he describes as these seditious and disgraceful proceedings.
And lastly this, upon the basis of whether it was genuine or a pretext. Even if it was technically an invalid marriage because of a pre-contract,
yes,
could Parliament at any time have reversed it and thereby legitimised the children?